Somewhere in this vast multiverse of alternate realities exists a timeline parallel to ours in which the Soviet Union created the first nuclear bomb and dropped it on Berlin to win the Second World War for the Allied powers in 1945. In the following years, each European nation slowly joined the communist bloc, with Britain being the final one to do so in 1953. As tensions rose between the US and the USSR, the Soviets would deploy mid-range nuclear arms on the island of Cuba in 1961. Following this, the USSR began politicking their ways into Central American countries to spread the influence of communism closer to the United States, which included Guatemala and Honduras in 1976. The spread of communism would continue to domino closer and closer to the US, and it soon even took over its neighbor as the Mexican Communist Party celebrated their presidential victory in 1996. Before much longer, a suspicious but unsuccessful attempt on the US president's life would be made in 2001. Finally, a large number of foreign spy drones would be detected by US citizens in 2003. But the very next day, everything would change as the USSR launched an invasive attack to seize control of the United States. Within hours, the Soviet Union took over New York, and the rest of the country would soon follow. But while the Soviets used every resource to tighten their grasp on America, a comparatively small militia of people, some soldiers, some average civilians, all people with everything to gain but nothing to lose. A militia formed to fight for their country, to fight for their land, to fight for their freedom. They are the Freedom Fighters. No, not those ones. Freedom Fighters is a video game set in 2003 but on an alternate timeline. In this universe, the Soviet Union created the A-bomb first and used that momentum to strengthen their communist sphere of influence to take over the rest of the world, concluding with the United States. But of course, even in an alternate timeline, America's not going to go down so easily. And through the leadership of our protagonist Chris Stone, we get to experience what it might be like fighting on the front lines of New York against an invasive foreign superpower. This is a game that I used to play a lot of when I was growing up, though admittedly it was mostly for the multiplayer mode. But I always loved giving its single player story a try to see how far I could go before giving up and putting some other random game that I owned into my PS2 instead. But not too long ago, I saw that this game that I used to love was on Steam, so I decided to try it out again as an adult, and I'm very glad I did. From its surprisingly strategic story mode, to its unique mechanics, to its interesting gunplay, Freedom Fighters was such a fun video game that absolutely deserves way more recognition than it's received. And it's also one of those games that absolutely should have gotten a sequel that just never came into fruition. So over the next however many minutes this video ends up being, I'm going to tell you why. Now, as I was talking about a little bit earlier, Freedom Fighters is a game that sort of flips the American war video game dynamic on its head, as most war games that we see, especially at the time of this one's release, usually have the player valiantly fighting as a decorated soldier for an organized American or Allied powers army who are leading an offensive on their adversaries. But throughout the course of this game, we play as a civilian and watch him turn into this badass warrior as he leads a militia of people who are desperate to preserve their way of life. At the start of the game, we're given a backstory for this alternate timeline, and through the power of exposition, we're told that the United States has remained the final frontier of freedom for over half a century. However, in 2003, aka the year this game was released, the Soviets finally stopped playing their political games and just flat out took over the last remnant of the Western world by force. On the day of the invasion, this pair of plumbing brothers, Mario and Chris and Troy Stone, were on their way to the apartment of reporter Isabella Angelina. When they arrive, however, they find nobody home and are instead ambushed by a group of Russian soldiers looking for Isabella. While Chris manages to hide from the soldiers, Troy is captured and taken into Soviet custody. Wait, you know what? I know I just made a joke about these guys being like Mario and Luigi, but as I'm sitting here writing this is deadass starting to remind me of the Mario movie plot. Anyway, once the soldiers move on, we take control of Chris and begin making our escape. Along the way, we encounter and rescue some key members of the Resistance, Mr. Jones and Phil Baxton. Throughout this first level of the game, we're essentially given a tutorial on some of this game's main mechanics, including using the weapon wheel, healing ourselves and our allies, and entering sewers. You know, kinda like Mario. Following this first mission, it's revealed that the Soviets have not only taken control of the news media, but were also informed by Lana from the WWE that New York has fallen to the Soviet Union. We're then introduced to our first headquarters in the sewers, and it's from here that the Freedom Fighters plan their attacks on their foreign invaders. Now, one really cool thing about this game is its multiple layers of strategy that you see play out throughout the story, and it's here that we start to dip our toes into this aspect of the game. While the first chapter of the story that I've already shown you is pretty linear, the second chapter, Soviet Domination, provides us with two missions that we have to bounce back and forth between in order to complete each one. At the start of the chapter, we have the choice to either go to the post office or the police station, and if we choose the latter, this police officer will give us some C4 and instruct us to commit an act of terrorism over to the other mission. So, you know, just a typical day in early 2000 New York. Anyway, with the C4 acquired, we now have to travel to the post office and bomb this gas station to eliminate the group of snipers that have the officers pinned down on the other map. As we continue through this mission, we run into a fellow freedom fighter who's guarding a base, but he won't let you in unless you save his leader, Isabella Angelina, who's been captured by the Soviets at, you guessed it, the police station. So now we have to travel back to the other map, and when we arrive, we see the effect that our actions have had on the world as the cops are no longer stuck fighting for their lives against the snipers. But in order to advance in the other mission, we still have to save Isabella, which leads us to having to infiltrate the police station while scavenging for supplies along the way, which is going to be a common theme in this game as pretty much all of our resources are scarce, just to add to the difficulty. As we advance further and further into the station, we eventually find and liberate Isabella, but we also take the police station back under American control by raising our flag. You know, kind of like how Mario always saves his princess and then takes down his enemy's flags. Sorry, but like, as I continue writing this, I just keep finding more and more parallels between this game and Mario. Actually, you know what? Remember when I was talking about all these alternate realities and shit? Now hear me out. What if the Super Mario Brothers is just another alternate timeline of our world? I mean, hell, Freedom Fighters is giving us two plumbing brothers fighting foreign invaders in New York, and didn't the end of the Super Mario movie literally give us that exact same plot? Alright, I really just used up like half a paragraph to make up some dumbass Super Mario lore, and for that, I apologize. So back to the task at hand. Now that Isabella's been freed, we're allowed to enter the Freedom Fighters base with her, and it's here that we get introduced to another core mechanic of this game, charisma. So by now, you've probably noticed that second bar below our health as well as those couple of dots. That second bar sort of acts as an XP bar, and as you complete heroic feats, you start to earn XP, or charisma. The number of dots below that bar indicates your charisma level and represents how many Freedom Fighters you can recruit to fight alongside you. If you've ever played GTA San Andreas, think of this as your level of respect. The more you have, the more gangsters you can recruit at once. At this point in the game, your charisma level allows you to recruit 2 men to fight with you, and the rest of this mission acts as a bit of a tutorial as to how you can lead them. In this stage, you're shown that your men have 4 different states of combat: attacking, defending, following, and injured. And you're also shown how to initiate each state. To send your men on the attack, simply look or aim at the enemy and press the attack command to send one of your troops after them, or you can hold the button to send in your entire squad. To defend an area, you do the same thing. Look or aim at the area, and press the defend command for one man, or hold the button for the whole squad. Following is the default state, and to get your men to return to it, just press the follow command. And injured, well, it's exactly what it sounds like. If one of your men takes too much damage, they'll go down and require a med kit to bring them back. This is where another level of strategy comes into play, because not only can you only carry so many med kits at a time, but they'll also become scarce real quickly, and you need to save some for yourself, because while your men are more useful when they're alive, keeping them healthy isn't exactly necessary to complete the mission, whereas when you die, you lose. This leads to you often having to make some tough calls as to whether or not to save an ally you just sent to his death in order for the rest of your team to advance, because if you use that medkit to bring him back, you might not have one for yourself later on. We'll get more into that later, but for now, it's time to save our brother, who's apparently been at the post office this whole time, as well as plant our American flag to finish the mission. The next chapter, In a New York Minute, gives us 3 new missions to complete in any order. Right, so remember earlier when I said that the previous chapter lets us dip our toes into some of the strategy of this game? Well, we finally get to dive all the way into it in this chapter. Like I said, you have the choice to complete any of these missions in whatever order. However, the ideal method is to run through the hotel first in order to pick up some C4. The reason for that is because once you've got some artillery, you're able to go to the fire station or the harbor and complete a side objective there that will make the rest of the chapter a whole lot easier. For example, if you go to the fire station mission and bomb this bridge, you'll cut off the Soviets' ability to transport reinforcements, effectively disabling enemy respawns in the other 2 missions. Alternatively, you can go to the harbor and destroy the helipad to take out the Soviets' air support, eliminating this bitch-ass helicopter from the equation on the other maps. Now, the fact that this level of mission branching and the heavy feeling of your decisions matter exists like this in a game from this era is astonishing, and that's not even considering the rest of the game's mechanics that exist on top of that. Anyway, the following few chapters follow along the same mission pattern where if you destroy something on one map, it makes the other map slightly easier. And you would think that after a while, this mission structure might get pretty tedious or boring, but the challenging difficulty that the devs added to each mission, from the tougher enemies you'll encounter to the scarcity of supplies and to the hard calls that you have to make as a leader, it all blends together with that level of strategy that I've been talking about to form an incredibly fun experience. Plus, even when it does start to get old having to follow this mission template, Freedom Fighters does a good job at switching things up every once in a while by giving you a more linear, single mission chapter that plays similarly to the tutorial mission at the beginning of the game. Anyway, at this stage of the game, Chris Stone is very much on the Soviet occupiers' radar, and has been dubbed the Freedom Phantom. As we continue to perform our terroristic actions against the great state of the USSR, they continually put the blame on us for the poor living conditions of the average citizen, claiming to the public that we are an enemy of the people. As months pass between each chapter, we're visibly told that the Freedom Fighters' forces are getting getting stronger and stronger, and this is shown both through the visual changes to our headquarters, as well as the changes to Chris's physical appearance. Soon, though, we eventually reach a critical point in the plot where Chris's brother Troy gets captured by the Soviets again and is forced to deliver a speech encouraging his brother to surrender. After he depressingly and defeatedly delivers the speech, he then courageously admits that everything he'd just spouted was lies, and pleads to his brother to keep fighting and set everyone free. These are the last words he speaks before he's beaten down by his Soviet captors and is subsequently executed. Now, I have to say that a game from this time that's this far under the radar has no right to be as well made as I've already described thus far, but the acting in this cutscene is top tier. Like, genuinely, if they ever remade Freedom Fighters with HD graphics, you might actually think this is real footage from a prisoner of war. The voice acting here from this defeated Troy Stone, and then his sudden shift into heroism as you hear what are his last televised words, is just phenomenal in my opinion. And it just makes this fictional story feel all the more real. But with our brother dead, it's time for us to take revenge by assassinating General Tatarin, the man who's led the Soviet forces thus far. This takes us to our first single mission chapter in a while, where we're now donned in some very appropriate assassin gear in order to do the job. After stealthing our way through Governor's Island, we ultimately take down Tatarin and return to the sewers, only to discover that Mr. Jones, the first ally that we make at the start of the game, was secretly the Soviet leader Colonel Bulba this whole time. He reveals that the reason he's been helping the Freedom Fighters is that he could play us into killing Tatarin so that he could take his place as general. With the Freedom Fighters headquarters compromised, we now have to fight through the Soviet army as we escape the sewers with a few of our allies and create a new HQ. From here, we launch a counteroffensive against the Soviets to take out their training facilities and take over the TV station. Once we have the media back under our control, Chris delivers an impassioned speech to rally the American people behind the Freedom Fighters. By this point, mainland New York has effectively been liberated from Soviet control, but we've still yet to push them out completely. This leads us back to Governor's Island, only this time, the level has been slightly reskinned with a coat of snow, once again proving that the visual storytelling in this game is nothing short of phenomenal. After we fight our way onto the island and take over the boat landing, we're taken to our final headquarters of the game, where it's truly established that Chris has become the leader of the Freedom Fighters. I say that because at the beginning of about every other chapter in this game, we sit and listen to the instructions of either Isabella, Phil, Mr. Jones, or the kid to figure out what we need to do in order to gain the upper hand against the Soviets. But when we arrive at our HQ this time, we see our Freedom Fighters standing around us and waiting to hear our orders in such a small but badass feeling moment. But anyway, with the boat landing secure, it's up to us to take back the other areas of the island one at a time as we prepare to take Fort J. First, we work our way through the munitions depot to acquire some C4. Next, we can either take the docks or target their artillery, either of which will disrupt their defenses. Finally, once all the surrounding areas are under our control, we can attack Fort J. Although technically, I think you could attack it first, but not only is this impractical since you can weaken the Soviets' forces in the other missions, but it also doesn't make a whole lot of sense story-wise either. Regardless, after we storm Fort J like it was on the banks of Normandy, we infiltrate the base and begin to raise our flags. Along the way, we run into Isabella, who was captured back in the sewers when Bulba revealed himself. With her and the rest of the Freedom Fighters at our side, we continue to push through the base and ultimately raise 4 American flags to officially liberate New York and beat the game. But it's not over quite yet. After you defeat the Soviets, we get a cutscene where the Americans are celebrating their victory, but Chris is sitting by himself feeling there's nothing to celebrate. He talks about how he's lost everything, and he tells Isabella that the Soviets will be back, stronger than ever. But even if that's true, Isabella reminds him that today, we are victorious. We showed our country that as long as there's hope for freedom, then it's worth fighting for, even if that means losing everything in the process. And while the rest of the country may still be occupied by the Soviet regime, New York is free, and it's all thanks to the Freedom Fighters. Man, what a story. Like I said before, this was a game that I used to play a lot growing up, albeit mostly for the multiplayer, but I did not remember its story being this goddamn good. Genuinely, I would have to put this up there with Grand Theft Auto 4 for how real it feels at times. I honestly can't think of any other war game from this time that had a story that felt this gritty, and there aren't even a lot of games that have come out since that have captivated me the same way Freedom Fighters did. Everything, from the depressing backdrops of your battlefields, to the tactical calls you have to make as you lead your allies to victory, to the freedom to choose the order in which you want to complete missions and your choice having a direct impact on other missions, to the amazing acting during the cutscenes, and to the exquisite score that ties it all together in a nice, red, communist-killing bow. Everything just comes together to form an amazing single-player experience. But what about its multiplayer experience? Like I said before, this game's multiplayer specifically was a big part of my childhood. I remember spending hours playing this mode with my brother, my cousins, and my friend across the street when I was little. And honestly, even in today's modern landscape, it's still a really fun game mode to just sit down and play. So the premise of the game mode is pretty simple. One team plays as the Americans, the other plays as the Soviets, and the team that can keep their flag raised the longest wins. But in addition to that, there's also 4 bunkers that are strategically placed around the map that serve as spawn points, defensive strongholds, and bases to recruit troops from. In order to take a bunker, you have to stand in it while there are no enemies present. At the very start of the game, this is a very simple task as no AI will have spawned yet. But once a bunker's been claimed, units will begin to occupy it, and they'll defend it when they see you or your allies. In order to capture it at this point, you have to kill all of the enemies within the bunker and stand inside of it. Once you do that, your troops will start spawning there, which you can recruit to help you on your offensive. Just like in single player, you can send your allies to target specific enemies, including other players, as well as have them defend a particular area, such as the flag. Now, like I said, the main goal of this game is to raise your flag in the center of the map, and when you do, this timer on the side of your screen will start to count down. If you can keep your flag raised until the time reaches 0, your team wins. However, if the opponents can raise their flag in its place, not only will their timer start to count down instead, but yours will actually start to increase by about 1 second for every 3 seconds, stretching your goalpost further until you can take it back. Freedom Fighters multiplayer mode may seem like a simple game of capture the flag at first, but once you actually get into it, it becomes sort of this 2-stage game where you have to balance your primary objective of raising the flag with your secondary objective of maintaining your bunkers. If you get too carried away with the flag, your enemy might seize the opportunity to take your bunkers and cripple your forces. But at the same time, if you put too much focus on taking bunkers, you might forget that you have to take back the flag and lose the game. It's such a genuinely fun and unique game mode that I can't really compare to anything else because I don't know if any other shooter has such a complexly strategic versus mode similar to this one. The only real downside I can come up with for this is the sad fact that this mode only exists on the console versions of Freedom Fighters and not the PC version, because playing this with a keyboard and mouse would only make me love this mode more, and the idea of playing it online rather than on split screen is a dream that I so badly wish could be a reality. One other drawback that arises from this limitation is the requirement to use a controller, which isn't something I'd usually complain about, but as I'll explain in a moment, some of the controls in this game are nothing but hell to overcome. I'll be the first to admit that I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this game on a mechanical level. Now, don't get me wrong, IO Interactive deserves a lot of praise for their ambitious attempts to make Freedom Fighters' world feel real with its impressive vaulting system, somewhat realistic weapon accuracy, and the aforementioned recruitment features, just to name a few mechanics. But as hard as they tried to make their level of realism feel fun, it's impossible to ignore the areas in which they came up short. First of all, we need to talk about the controls. Now, playing Freedom Fighters with a keyboard and mouse on the PC version, it doesn't feel too bad at all. The aiming is standard, your movement feels responsive, and other controls like switching weapons and commanding your men feel fine. However, if you play this game on a controller, you're gonna wonder exactly what strain of crack the devs were smoking when they came up with a button layout that I can only describe as sadistic. Okay, I won't go that far to call the controls sadistic, but they're definitely nothing short of retarded. For starters, take a guess as to which button is the jump button. Just take a guess. Did you guess L1? No, of course you didn't, because you probably got more than 2 brain cells in that skull of yours and understand that X is the only button that should ever be used for jumping, unless you're playing GTA or something. Which even then, at least on Xbox controllers, X is still the jump button. But if you think that's bad, sit back and listen to the rest of these controls. To shoot is R1, to melee is R2, to crouch is L2, and to aim is L3. Now, shooting and meleeing being where they are is somewhat forgivable, since that was the standard layout for shooters back during the PS2 era. And if controllers had triggers back then these two controls almost certainly would have been switched around. But crouching being L2? Who the hell had the bright idea to let L2 be the crouch button? I want names. And then for the aim button to be L3? Why the fuck would anybody in their right mind actively choose to make an analog stick be your aim button, let alone the analog stick you use to fucking walk? Alright, so the controls in this game, they're very wonky. No, they're incredibly wonky. But that being said, I can understand why they are. Freedom Fighters came out in a time when there weren't a whole lot of shooters on the market yet, let alone third-person ones. Hell, even Grand Theft Auto is having trouble finding the right control scheme at this point, as they were still using circle as the shoot button. This was an era of experimentation. There were no guidelines to follow yet because they were the ones setting them. So for IO to get a few things wrong on their way to crafting a game as great as this one from scratch, it's understandable. And it's also fair to assume, with the need to assign behind the face buttons to leader commands, as well as R3 and the D-pad being dedicated to the weapon wheel, that some sacrifices within the control scheme had to be made. Though, under these circumstances, I do wish that the main menu on the console version of this game allowed you to remap the controls the way that you see fit, just like how the PC version does. But again, I think I'm expecting a little too much from a PS2 era game. Sticking with the curious decision making of this game, it's time to address Freedom Fighter's problem with weapon accuracy. As I'm sure many of you know, a lot of shooter games employ an element of bloom when it comes to accuracy, and there are other games that opt for a more recoil heavy way of making it harder to land your shots. Freedom Fighters goes for a mixture of these by using recoil and bloom to make shooting a lot tougher, but it does this in such a backwards way that it can make it physically impossible to shoot somebody who's not even that far away from you. The reason I call it backwards is because what you'd expect from a system like this is that the first shot you fire out of your gun would be accurate enough to hit whatever you're aiming at, and each subsequent shot you take without a break would maybe land a little away from your target while your gun jolts to disrupt your crosshair, thus making your next shot even harder to hit. I'm using footage of my modded GTA 4 playthrough here because a couple of the mods that I'm using do exactly what I described to create this challenging but fun experience. But what Freedom Fighters does instead of this is it adds bloom to that first shot as well, which effectively eliminates the possibility to kill somebody from a decent distance when you consider that you also have to be lucky enough to land several of these inaccurate shots to take them down. Don't get me wrong here, this uniquely difficult aspect of the gunplay honestly does add to the fun for me in most scenarios, and it certainly makes the game a lot more challenging to play through as well as more strategic as it forces you to rely on your allies more. Though, I just wish they didn't have to artificially inflate this game's difficulty with some gunplay that easily could have been tweaked to make the experience more bearable. But I do have to say, one positive that comes from these shoddy gun controls is that the sniper easily becomes the deadliest weapon in the entire game, since your bullets actually hit where you're aiming, and the fact that it's so scarce in the single player mode makes it feel like a blessing whenever you do find one. Oh, and one more thing I want to mention real quick regarding the gunplay is that if you're in close quarters, your hip fire becomes the deadliest tool in your arsenal, as the lock-on here lets you tear through your enemies. So those were the main things I wanted to talk about in this chapter, but there's still a couple of additional mechanics I wanted to at least mention real quick before we move on. First off is the weapon wheel. Now this may be a very common feature that we've taken for granted in modern video games, but back when Freedom Fighters first released, this was innovative. Now I don't know what game was the first to ever include a weapon wheel, but I've done my fair share of research trying to find out, only to learn that such a level of research is above my pay grade. But in all seriousness, it's hard to tell who came up with the concept of a weapon wheel, but I know it wasn't a common feature during this era, and to have the foresight to include such a useful feature in a game that really needed something like it due to all the supplies you're constantly carrying, you've got to give IO props for their ambition. Something else I wanted to give a brief mention to is the vaulting system. This is something that's become common in the years since Freedom Fighter's release, but I don't know of another shooter prior to this where the ability to vault over ledges and through windows was a feature. Lastly, and this isn't really a mechanic but rather a satisfying feature, the ragdoll physics. Again, this was an era when death animations were pre-rendered, and while this is nothing like GTA 4's Euphoria physics, it's still so satisfying to see bodies get absolutely launched from an explosion, or to watch your enemy go flying like his head's been shot off whenever you snipe the shit out of him. When it comes to Freedom Fighter's mechanics, the devs at IO show a lot of ambition by cramming in so many features that are expected in a modern video game of this genre, but the fact that they did so in 2003 is such an incredible feat. Of course, there are areas in which their ambition comes back to shoot them in the foot, but luckily they made their own bullets so inaccurate that they missed that shot because even things like their crappy gunplay can be redeemed by how surprisingly fun they can be, and even the console version's unholy control schemes can be forgiven due to the circumstances. But how do all these things add up with the rest of the game? In my honest opinion, Freedom Fighters is a very ambitious title. In terms of its mechanics and features, this feels like a game that, with a graphical overhaul, could have come out during the last console generation, or possibly even this one. It's a game that came out in an era when the typical multiplayer shooter consisted of nothing more than a team deathmatch mode, and for that reason, I feel that Freedom Fighters' complex and strategic multiplayer mode is way ahead of its time, and its story mode was so gritty, adult, and real that it felt like it could go hand in hand with the world of GTA 4. The only negative of the story I can really think of is the room the writers left for a sequel that never came, which is very unfortunate because if there ever was a game deserving of a sequel, I think it's this one. A sequel seemed to have been planned when this game came out if Chris's dialogue at the end of the story is anything to go by. In the final cutscene, when he's talking about how there's nothing to celebrate, he talks about how the Soviets will be back and will be stronger than before, and it can also be inferred that the Soviets still have a tight grip on the rest of the country, which seems to be an obvious prelude for the next game in the series that sadly never came into fruition. Additionally, Eidos Interactive, the company that went on to acquire IO, announced in 2004 that a sequel was planned to be released in 2005. However, hopes for a Freedom Fighters 2 diminished with the announcement of Canon Lynch Dead Men, and the last statement from IO regarding a sequel came from a tweet in 2011. This really sucks because not only do we not get to see a more modern version of this incredible game, but it also sucks because there is clearly so much story to tell here, and we'll likely never get an official continuation of it where we see Chris and the rest of the Freedom Fighters take back the rest of the country from an ever-strengthening Soviet regime. There's so many other settings outside of New York too that we could have gotten to see as battlefields ravaged by Cold War aggression. Imagine historical cities like Philadelphia or Washington DC occupied by Soviet invaders. Glamorous cities like Miami or Los Angeles juxtaposed by the brutal war. Or cities that I'm obviously biased about like Detroit being, well, Detroit on a typical Tuesday. And not only that, but remember how I was talking about IO's ambition in regards to creating Freedom Fighters 1? Well, think about what they might have the potential to create in a Freedom Fighters 2. And for that matter, think about how much they could expand their multiplayer mode. Imagine if this mode had online functionality, as well as more than just 4 players, and perhaps larger battlefields with more bunkers to occupy and possibly more side objectives to complete. The possibilities are endless, which makes it all the more sadder to think of the improbability that we'll ever see it. But even if we never see IO's take on a Freedom Fighters sequel, at least we're blessed enough to have this amazing game to fall back on. And if you've never played Freedom Fighters before, let me tell you first of all that you're missing out. And second, this is luckily a fairly accessible game still. If you've got a PS2, an original Xbox, or a GameCube lying around, all you need to do is find a copy somewhere, put it in your console, and fire that boy up. Alternatively, if you prefer emulation over original hardware, you could always run a PCSX2, Zemu, or Dolphin, the emulators for the respective consoles I just listed. Acquire Freedom Fighters by whichever means you see fit, wink, and boot it up. Though I'd only recommend this route if you're strictly trying to play the multiplayer, or you really want to play with a controller, because if you're already using a PC to play this game, then at that point you might as well just run the PC version, which you can just buy on Steam for like 15 bucks. It should be noted, by the way, that the PC version doesn't have controller support for whatever reason, but considering the disgusting button layout they use for the console versions, it's definitely for the best that they just force you to run keyboard and mouse, to be honest. But no matter which platform you choose, I hope that at least one person takes my advice of trying out this hidden gem, because to me, it's a game that deserves way more recognition, and it's such a shame that it's been under so many people's radars for as long as it has. And who knows, if you do decide to try it out and end up liking it, you might end up filling countless hours running through the story, having fun with the mechanics, going back and forth with your buddies in the multiplayer mode, and just immersing yourself into this game's wonderful story. Or you might end up having to ask Steam for a refund, which can still be a fun experience. But if you do try it and thoroughly enjoy it, maybe you'll also end up in the small group of people like me clamoring for a sequel. And maybe you'll even make your own plea for IO to make one, just like I'm doing with this video. Well, I bet you weren't expecting this one, were you? What the hell is Freedom Fighters? I thought you only talked about Grand Theft Auto games. Don't get me wrong, I plan on going back to GTA after this video, but there's only so many videos that I'll be able to make on those games. And it's also not the only franchise I'm interested in making videos on. The fact is, I have a whole lot of nostalgia for the PS2 era of video games, and I played a huge variety of them when I was little, so there's gonna be some videos like this mixed in with the GTA ones every once in a while. I just hope you guys don't decide to stop watching me because of that. But then again, if you've made it this far into the video, I think I can be pretty confident that you'll stick around, and I appreciate that. Also, I just wanted to shamelessly plug my Twitch channel and Discord server once again. As of the time of recording this, I'm about to start streaming some American Truck Simulator, and I even have a steering wheel just to add to the chaos. And I've also been playing a little bit of Bully here and there, so if you're interested in watching anything like that, then feel free to come by and catch me on Twitch. As for my Discord server, I'm still in the beginning stages of building a community over there, and I do my best to keep everybody updated there as far as my progress on these videos is concerned, as well as let everybody know when I'm going live on Twitch. So if you want to be part of my community and keep up to date on everything, then feel free to join in. The links to both my Twitch and Discord will be posted in the comments below. Lastly, to anybody who's made it this far into the video, I just want to go ahead and give you a quick thank you for giving this non-GTA video a chance. I hope I was still able to keep you entertained with my ramblings about a game you probably never knew existed, and I also hope I might have been able to convince you to try it out. But whether or not you do, let me say it one more time. Thank you. Thank you for watching, thank you for supporting me, and thank you for allowing me this time with you. I hope each of you have a blessed day, and I'll see you all in the next one. Catch you later, guys.